You gave it away, bit by bit, piece by piece, just to watch how they'd misuse it, how they'd ruin everything they touched, how they'd dig their own graves with the same hands you once held out to save them. Don't sit here acting like it was an accident. Nah, you're too calculated for that. You don't slip. You allow. You observe. You let them drown in what they asked for. They think silence means weakness. They think distance means you're broken. But you weren't breaking. You were building a fire, letting everything you gave them burn in their hands like dynamite on a timer. Tick, tick, boom. You didn't lose control, you handed it over and waited. Waited for the screams, for the blame, for the desperate calls that came too late. That's what they don't get. The real danger isn't someone who shouts. It's someone who lets you implode while they light a cigarette and walk away. You were too kind at first. That was your first mistake. You walked in like a healer, but they saw you as a fool. You offered peace, and they treated it like weakness. You offered time, and they wasted it. You gave them your presence, and they took it as guaranteed. That's what the world does. They feast on the loyal and glorify the ones who walk away. But you didn't walk away. Not yet. You stood still. That's what messed with their heads, that cold silence, that stillness. You didn't cry. You didn't scream. You just stopped explaining. And that silence, that's what drove them crazy. That's when the mirror cracked. You see, people like that, they don't fear your presence. They fear your absence. They don't crumble when you're angry. They crumble when you stop trying. Because that's when they realize they were never in control. You were. Always were. But you let them burn in the fantasy that they were running the show. You played quiet, but you weren't blind. You saw everything, and you chose silence because you knew it was the sharpest blade in your arsenal. They always think they've got time, don't they? They think your patience is infinite, that your loyalty is on autopilot. But here's the thing. Real ones, we don't explode. We evolve. We sit. We watch. We count. Every time they cross the line and we don't say a word. We just stack the disrespect like chips in a game they don't know they're playing. Until one day, we vanish. Just like that. No warnings, no goodbye, just absence. And that's when the fear sets in. That's when their nights get loud. That's when the silence eats them alive. You didn't lose control, you mastered it. You sharpened it. You turned it into a weapon. You let them dance on their own landmines while you stood back, arms crossed, watching them explode one by one. They thought they were hurting you, but all they did was set themselves on fire. And you didn't even flinch. You know what people hate more than being exposed? Being ignored. You gave them the rope. They chose to hang themselves with it. You stood there, watching their hands shake while they tied the knot. That's not weakness. That's power. That's discipline. That's what makes you dangerous. Because you could have spoken, you could have reacted, but you didn't. You chose to let the silence do the talking. And trust me, silence screams in ways words never could. They thought they had you figured out. They thought you were easy to predict. But they forgot something. Monsters don't announce themselves. They emerge. And when they do, it's too late. You didn't break down. You didn't spiral. You just turned the switch off. No emotions. No explanations. Just a void where your warmth used to be. And when people feel that void, they realize who you were, what you were worth, but by then, it's already over. They won't tell the truth about you. They'll rewrite the story, paint themselves as victims, blame you for leaving, blame you for going cold. But deep down, they know. They know why. They know what they did. That's why they talk behind your back instead of to your face. That's why they tell stories instead of seeking closure. Because closure requires honesty. And honesty would shatter the fake image they built. You didn't lose control. You just stopped babysitting their egos. You stopped being the bigger person. You stopped swallowing your hurt to make them feel whole. You let the cracks show, and they panicked. You let the lies echo, and they choked on them. You let the silence grow, and it suffocated them. That's not weakness. That's strategy. You let them burn in the fire they thought they were immune to. And the beauty? You didn't have to lift a finger. You didn't raise your voice. You just disappeared and let the absence do the damage. They're gonna tell people you changed, that you flipped, that you woke up one day and chose to be cold. But they'll never say why. They'll never say how many chances you gave, how many late nights you spent overthinking the same damn patterns, how many times you bit your tongue to keep the peace. No, that part disappears, erased, because it doesn't serve their story. Their story needs a villain. And since you stopped bleeding for them, guess who they picked? You. But the truth is simple. You didn't change. You adjusted. You finally matched their energy. You started playing the game by their rules. And they hated it because you were better at it. You gave them the love they never earned, the time they never valued, and the loyalty they weren't ready for. And when you stopped, they called it betrayal. But if silence is betrayal, then what do you call using someone's heart like a convenience store? What do you call making someone feel guilty for expecting the bare minimum? What do you call pretending to care just enough to keep them around while you feed your ego with their effort? That ain't love, that's manipulation. And the second you saw it for what it was, you stopped participating. And they couldn't handle that. You want to know the real reason they fell apart when you pulled back? It wasn't because they missed you. It was because they missed control over you. They missed the version of you that didn't question, didn't challenge, didn't walk away. That version of you, the one that gave infinite passes, it was their favorite. Not because they loved it, but because it was useful, predictable, safe. But when that version died, when you resurrected into something colder, sharper, quieter, that's when they realized they never knew you at all. They only knew the parts you let them manipulate. The rest, the darkness, the depth, the boundaries you were forced to build, that's the part that they never saw coming. You were the storm they joked about until it arrived. And now they're drenched in the mess they made, begging for umbrellas in a downpour they caused. You didn't become a monster. You responded to one. You didn't grow thorns because you wanted to hurt people. You grew them because you got tired of bleeding for hands that were never gentle. That's the truth they won't admit. That's the truth they'll choke on in private while pretending to be saints in public. You know what the sickest part is? They could have had you forever. You weren't temporary. You weren't a moment. You were a lifetime, disguised in human skin. And they saw it, but didn't believe it. Or worse, they believed it, and still gambled it away, thinking you'd always be there. That's the ego. That's the disease. They think people like you don't walk away. They think you stay, no matter how many times they disappoint you. But the truth is, even the strongest souls get tired. Even the warriors with the biggest hearts have breaking points. And once that point hits, it's over. You can't glue trust back together. You can't rewind disrespect. You can't expect someone to keep holding a hand that's been slapping them. Eventually, even the kindest hearts go cold. Not out of hate, but out of exhaustion, out of self-defense. You didn't become numb overnight. You were just overstimulated with betrayal. And now you sit in silence. Not because you have nothing to say, but because nothing you say would matter to ears that only listen when they're comfortable. You gave control to the chaos, not because you were weak, but because you wanted the truth to reveal itself. And it did. Look at them now. Confused, bitter, talking like victims in stories they authored, rewriting timelines so they can sleep at night, making up versions of events that make them look noble and you look cruel. But it's all noise. And you don't argue with noise. You don't defend your name in rooms you're not even in. That's the lesson. That's what people like you learn after being betrayed too many times. You learn to let the story tell itself. You let them speak. You let them lie. And you just keep moving. Because real ones don't prove, they show. And when the time comes, when the dust settles, and the masks fall off, the truth will scream louder than any rumor they ever whispered. That's what they forgot. That's what they'll remember too late. You were never just another person. You were the test, the one that shows what they do with something real. And they failed. miserably. So let them burn. Let the silence spread. Let the control you handed over become the fire they can't escape. Because in the end, you didn't lose control. You just watched what they did with it. Let me tell you something they'll never say out loud. They knew exactly what they were doing. Every time they ignored your effort, every time they laughed when you needed support, every time they played dumb while you begged for clarity, they knew. People act confused when accountability shows up at their doorstep, but confusion is just a costume. Underneath it, awareness, intent, calculation. They were never blind. They were just hoping you were. And for a while, maybe you were. Maybe you believed the excuses. Maybe you told yourself, they're just going through something. Or maybe I'm overthinking it. But deep down, something was rotting. The signs were there. The inconsistencies, the delays, the way they only showed up when it benefited them. And when you finally saw it, when it slapped you in the face so hard you couldn't ignore it anymore, you didn't confront them. Nah, you evolved past that. You chose the cruelest response of all. Nothing. You didn't scream. You didn't beg. You didn't demand explanations. You just stopped showing up. And that silence was louder than anything you ever could have said. Because it wasn't empty. It was filled with the truth. The kind of truth that hits at 2 a.m. when they can't sleep and there's no one left to blame. They'll sit there acting like they miss you, like they lost a good one. But what they really miss is access. Access to your energy, your consistency, your mind. You were their emotional charger, their backup plan, their secret source of power. And when you unplugged, everything dimmed. Suddenly the attention didn't feel the same. Suddenly the games weren't working. Suddenly the validation they fed on was gone. And they had to face the emptiness they kept avoiding. That's why they spiral. Not because they lost someone, they've lost people before, but because they lost someone who knew their soul. You weren't some random. You saw through them, past the performance, past the mask. You knew the real them. And when someone knows you that deeply and still chooses silence over reconciliation, that's when the panic hits. That's when their world collapses. Because now they're not just facing loss, they're facing exposure. And nothing's more terrifying to a manipulator than the thought that you saw everything and still walked away like they meant nothing. Because in the end, they didn't. You didn't hand them silence to be petty. You handed them silence to protect your peace. You didn't walk away to prove a point. You walked away because you finally understood yours. That no matter how much love you give, it'll never be enough for someone who's addicted to attention, ego, and options. That's the sickness. People want loyalty like it's a subscription they don't have to pay for. They want love that demands nothing, forgiveness without limits, and presence without effort. But that's not how this works. That's not how you work. You're not built to chase. You're not designed to beg. You are a storm contained in skin. And when you walk, when you really walk, it's not quiet. It's catastrophic. Because it means someone just lost the rarest thing they'll ever find. Someone who was ready to stay, even after they destroyed everything. And that kind of loss haunts. It burns, not immediately, but over time, slowly, like a match still flickering on the edge of a memory. Every song, every smell, every conversation that reminds them of what they threw away becomes poison. And you just keep walking, unbothered, because peace doesn't beg. They'll search for you in every person they meet next. That's the curse. That's the price of having someone like you and taking it for granted. They'll smile at new faces, laugh with new people, but it'll all feel hollow because nobody gives like you did. Nobody loves like you did. Nobody sees them like you did. And they'll feel it, especially at night, especially when things go quiet. That's when your silence starts to scream. That's when their conscience turns into a courtroom. That's when the truth hits like a freight train. And no matter how much they try to outrun it, it always finds them. Because the truth doesn't disappear. It waits. And when it arrives, it brings all the weight they thought they escaped. You didn't lose control. You chose silence over chaos. You chose dignity over drama. You chose healing over fixing what didn't want to be fixed. And now, they have to live in the ruins of what they destroyed. You didn't become cold. You just got tired of setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. So you stopped, and they froze. You want to know what makes silence so deadly? It's the way it echoes. It doesn't need volume to destroy. It just needs time. Time to sink into their skin. Time to turn every unfinished sentence into a blade. Time to make them wonder, what were they thinking when they walked away? And trust me, they wonder every damn day. Because you didn't leave with fireworks, you left with stillness. With no closure, no speech. Just the sound of the door closing and the absence of a presence they thought they'd always have. That's what breaks people. Not the scream, but the lack of it. Because a scream means you still care. A scream means you're still engaged in the war. But when you say nothing, that's when they realize the war is already over and they lost. You didn't flinch. You didn't look back. You just cut the thread clean and let them free fall into their own regrets. That's what silence is. It's not weakness. It's warfare, the most refined kind. And only those who've been betrayed too many times learn how to use it. Only those who've been shattered and stitched themselves back together learn the language of not saying a word. But here's the part they'll never admit. They thought you'd come back. That's the ugly little secret behind their arrogance. They thought they'd break you, and you'd still show up. That they could spit on everything you gave, and you'd still be waiting at the door. That they could talk to you like you were disposable, and you'd keep proving them wrong with more love. But you didn't. You didn't come back. You didn't explain. You didn't even retaliate. You just left them with the one thing they feared most, themselves. You see, when someone's been using you as a distraction from their own emptiness, the scariest thing you can do is leave them alone with it. That silence becomes a mirror, and they hate mirrors because they show the cracks, the lies, the manipulation, and most of all, they show how small they really are without someone like you propping them up. That's the pain they carry now. Not just the loss of your presence, but the exposure of their truth. You were the light that made their shadows visible. And when you left, the shadows swallowed them. Let's not play dumb. You saw this coming. You always do. You felt the shift, the slight tone changes, the delayed replies, the way your value was measured only by how useful you were in that moment. You felt it, and still you stayed a little longer, not because you were stupid, but because you hoped they'd wake up, that they'd realize who they had before it was too late, that maybe, just maybe, they'd evolve. But they didn't. And so when you finally let go, you did it with full awareness. That's what makes it so brutal. You left with open eyes. You didn't ghost them. You buried them in their own actions. And the silence? That wasn't the absence of love. It was the funeral of it. That's what people don't get. Walking away doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from clarity, from realizing you're watering a dead garden, from understanding that no matter how much you give, it'll never be enough for someone who only knows how to take. And so, you stopped. You didn't lose control. You reclaimed it. You snatched it back from the hands that mishandled it. And when they dropped it, you didn't pick it up. You let them feel the weight of what they broke. And now? Now they look at the door you closed and wonder what would have happened if they had just treated you better. If they had just said thank you. If they had just been honest. But regret is a slow killer. It doesn't punch you in the face. It bleeds you out, drop by drop. Every memory becomes a reminder. Every silence becomes a scream. Every smile they see in someone else's face reminds them of the one they lost in yours. And the worst part? They can't reverse it. Because they weren't just careless. They were willfully careless. That's the crime. Not ignorance, arrogance. And when you gave them silence instead of revenge, they thought they won. But now they realize the silence was the revenge. Because it never ends. It follows them, reminds them, haunts them. That's the price of mishandling a real one. You don't just lose them, you lose access to peace. Forever. Let them tell their version. Let them play innocent. Let them cry to their little audience. Let them paint you cold, bitter, heartless. whatever helps them sleep. That's the only thing left for them now, a fabricated story. But the truth? It doesn't need defense. It doesn't need an audience. It sits in silence, patient, knowing that time exposes what pride hides. They'll go on pretending, but every time they fake a smile, it'll crack. Every time they talk about you like you meant nothing, their voice will tremble, because you did mean something, more than they were ready for, more than they deserved. And that's the part they can't silence inside themselves. That voice that whispers, you had something rare, and you destroyed it. That's what they can't shake. Not because of guilt, but because you never gave them the satisfaction of watching you break. That's what stings. You didn't fall apart. You didn't spiral. You didn't chase. You just disappeared. Like smoke from a fire they started, thinking they'd be the ones walking away. But the joke's on them. You left them in the ashes. Now they're coughing on their own destruction. And all they have left is your silence echoing through their regrets. You didn't turn into someone else. That's the lie they'll tell others to feel better. They changed. Number you just stopped pretending. You took the mask off. The one that smiled when you were hurt. The one that stayed calm while they pushed every button. The one that tried to fix what was never broken in you, but broken in them. You stopped shrinking to make them feel big. Stopped softening your truth to protect their insecurities. Stopped handing out forgiveness like candy to someone who only learned to take, never to give. And in that moment, when you chose you, they lost access to everything they took for granted. That love, gone. That patience, spent. That presence, erased. Not because you hated them. No, hate would have meant they still had control. But what you gave them was worse. Indifference. The moment you stopped caring, that was the real funeral. That was when the final nail hit the coffin. Because nothing is colder than being forgotten by someone who used to set themselves on fire to keep you warm. And that's what you did, isn't it? You gave warmth. You gave light. And they used it to cast shadows until you finally walked and took the sun with you. Now they talk about loyalty. Now they talk about real ones. Now they suddenly remember what you were worth. But it's not coming from reflection. It's coming from lack. They're not sorry. They're lonely. There's a difference. They don't miss you. They miss what you did for them. The attention, the healing, the reassurance, the stability you brought to their chaos. You were their emotional home. And now they're out in the cold, knocking on doors that don't open the same. That's what you left behind, a void they can't fill. Because they weren't looking for love. They were looking for a host. And you were the perfect one. Until you realized you were feeding a parasite. And when that hit you, you didn't scream. You didn't fight. You simply stopped. Stopped explaining. Stopped justifying. stopped hoping. You stepped back and let them see themselves without the mirror you used to hold up for them. And what did they see? Nothing. Nothing but the truth they kept denying. That they were the villain in a story where you were the cure. And when the cure leaves, the sickness gets louder. Here's the hardest pill they'll ever swallow. They could have had forever, but they played with it like it was temporary. You weren't asking for much, just effort, just honesty, just a little reciprocity. But for people like them, even the bare minimum feels like a burden, because effort reveals intention, and they never had the right intentions to begin with. They were there for the convenience, for the benefits, for the version of you that made their life easier. But the second you needed them, the second you needed their support, their presence, their truth, gone, quiet, distant, suddenly too busy. And still, you stayed. You gave them more rope, not realizing they were using it to strangle your spirit. But now they sit with that rope around their own neck. And every memory of you, it tightens. Every smile you gave, every time you forgave, it tightens. Because they thought you'd never leave. They thought you were the fool in love. But what they didn't know is that love turns lethal when it's no longer blind. And you didn't lose control. You saw clearly for the first time, and you let everything burn that needed to. You want to know why they're so loud now? Why they suddenly have so much to say about you? It's because silence makes cowards scream. The second you stop speaking, the second you stop defending yourself, they panicked. Because now, the story is out of their hands. Now, they're left in the dark, wondering what you know, what you saw, what you'll do next. And nothing scares a manipulator more than uncertainty. When you were talking, they could control the narrative. They could gaslight, twist, rewrite. But now you've gone ghost. Now you've vanished like smoke. And the only thing they can cling to is the guilt that keeps replaying in their heads. That's why they post more. That's why they talk more. That's why they try harder to seem happy, unaffected, healed. Because they're not trying to move on. They're trying to convince themselves they were right to lose you. But no lie can outrun silence. No mask can survive the weight of being alone with the truth. And you didn't just walk away. You left a mirror in your place. And every day, they have to look into it and confront what they did when they thought you'd never leave. They'll try to replace you. Oh, they already have. Or they will. Quick, desperate, sloppy. Trying to fill the gap like you were something that could be copied and pasted. But what they'll realize, what they'll never admit, is that no one has your mind. No one has your heart. No one has your silence, your chaos, your loyalty wrapped in fire. They'll chase the ghost of you in every person they meet. But no matter how many faces they try to love, None of them will feel like you. Because you weren't just a person. You were an experience, an era, a damn revolution in their life. And you weren't loud about it. You didn't walk in making noise. You just existed. You were there. And they felt that. Every time you showed up when they didn't deserve it. Every time you stayed when they gave you every reason not to. And now that you're gone, that absence is louder than any presence they'll ever find. Because nothing haunts a guilty conscience more than the echo of someone who loved them right and left quiet. Let them call you cold. Let them say you changed. Let them scream to the world that you gave up. What they'll never say is how many times you showed up when you had nothing left. How many pieces of yourself you broke just to keep the connection alive. How many nights you swallowed your pride, your pain, your own damn instincts, just to give them one more chance. That's the part they bury. That's the version of you they delete from the script. 'Cause to tell that truth, it would make them the villain. And people like them, they don't do accountability. They don't do reflection. They rewrite. They repaint. They put a fresh coat over the damage and act like the cracks were your fault. But you remember. You remember every ignored message, every lie masked as a joke, every moment they chose attention over your soul. And now they feel it. Not because you cursed them, not because you're bitter, but because you healed and they stayed the same. That's the real revenge. Not becoming worse, but becoming untouchable. They'll find someone else. Of course they will. But it won't be love. It'll be a distraction, a weak imitation, something to keep their hands busy while their mind screams your name. And it'll work for a while, until they realize that fake affection can't replace real presence, that forced laughter can't drown out real silence, and that being with someone doesn't mean being seen by someone. You saw them, all of them, even the parts they hid, and instead of running, you loved them, and instead of judging, you stayed, until it became unbearable to keep pretending they were someone worth saving. You didn't lose them. They lost you. And they'll spend the rest of their lives realizing that truth in slow motion. Regret isn't loud, it's quiet. It creeps in while they smile for pictures, while they hold new hands, while they scroll through memories they swore didn't matter. Regret is subtle. It's a ghost. And now, you're the one who haunts them. Not out of vengeance, but because your silence built a grave too deep to climb out of. And now, here they are, watching you from the shadows, quiet, bitter, jealous of your peace. You see, they didn't expect you to thrive without them. That wasn't part of their plan. In their heads, you were supposed to break. You were supposed to fall apart, crawl back, beg for closure, ask for answers. But you didn't. You stood still, then you walked away. And the craziest part? You never looked back. That's what shattered them. Not the goodbye, but the silence after it. Because that's when they realized they didn't break you. They exposed themselves. And now the mask they wore for years is slipping. And you didn't even have to say a word. They're unraveling in real time. Every fake smile, every lie they tell to mutual friends, every subtle post, every low-key jab, every forced laugh. It's desperation in disguise, because the one person who always forgave them is gone. The one person who always tried, gone. The one person who knew the worst in them and still gave their best, gone. And no amount of pretending can replace that. No cheap rebound can silence that truth. You were a rare breed, and now they're left choking on normal. Here's the truth that eats them alive. You were willing to give them everything, not halfway, not conditionally, everything. You were the type who showed up at 2 a.m. if they needed someone, the type who would have bled just to make them feel whole. And they knew it. That's what makes the silence unbearable. Because they didn't lose someone who hurt them, they lost someone who would have carried them through hell. And they can't spin that. They can't justify that loss. So they do what the weak always do. They vilify what they can't replace. You changed. You got distant. You became someone else. Number, you just got tired. Tired of feeling like a placeholder. Tired of being loyal to someone who couldn't even be honest. Tired of handing out loyalty like candy in a world full of pickpockets. You gave them peace, and they turned it into war. You gave them truth, and they used it against you. So you gave them what they never expected. Nothing. And that emptiness they feel now. That's not karma. That's cause and effect. You didn't become cold. You became clear. There's a difference. People think emotional distance is cruelty, but sometimes it's the last act of self-love. Because if you don't protect your peace, they'll drain it. If you don't value your voice, they'll silence it. And if you don't walk away, they'll never stop taking. So you walked. Not because you stopped caring, but because you cared too much for too long. And the longer you stayed, the more pieces of yourself you had to bury. But you're not a graveyard. You're not a museum for broken promises. You're a storm wrapped in skin. A survivor wearing silence like armor. And you knew letting go wasn't weakness. It was survival. Because loving them was starting to kill you. Slowly, quietly, day by day. And the most dangerous kind of pain is the kind that teaches you how to smile through it. That's the pain you mastered. That's why they can't reach you now. Because you've built walls out of every scar, gates out of every goodbye, and peace out of every piece they left behind. They won't say your name out loud anymore. They'll whisper it, or avoid it, or bury it in sarcasm. Because saying it hurts. Saying it brings back the reality they're running from, that they had a real one, and they blew it. That they were seen, understood, forgiven, loved, and still chose ego over everything. And now all they have is the silence. Your silence. And that silence, it's louder than anything they'll ever hear, because it says everything they pretended not to understand. It says, I loved you. I tried. You failed. It says, I was there. You weren't. It says, I saw the darkness, and I walked away before it swallowed me too. You didn't lose control. You sacrificed connection to save your soul. And in a world where everyone wants to be loud, dramatic, and seen, you disappeared. And that was the loudest thing you've ever done. And now that you're gone, really gone, they finally understand the weight of your silence. Not the kind that disappears for a few hours or a couple of days. Number. The kind that never comes back. The kind that deletes numbers without warning. That blocks without drama. That forgets birthdays, stops checking stories, stops replying to messages that should have come months ago. The kind of silence that doesn't carry revenge, but carries release. You weren't being petty. You were being surgical. You cut the cancer out without apology. You let them rot in the grave they were digging with their own hands. And you didn't even toss a rose on the way out. Because after everything they did, the lies, the gaslighting, the betrayal masked as jokes, you realized the only way to win was to vanish. No warning, no closure, just one day, gone. And that silence, it isn't empty, it's heavy. It's filled with everything they refused to hear when you were speaking. Every warning they ignored. Every soft plea they laughed at. Now those same words replay in their heads, like ghosts scratching at the door. But the door doesn't open anymore. You closed it, locked it, burned it, and they don't have the map back to you anymore. You know what's funny? They really thought you were weak, that your love made you soft, that your kindness made you stupid, that your loyalty made you blind. And that's where they messed up. Because people like you, you're not weak, you're just merciful. Until you're not. And once that mercy runs out, it's gone forever. There's no second wave, no rebound, no surprise comeback. When you switch off, it's permanent. Because you gave them chance after chance after chance. Not because they deserved it, but because you did, because that's who you are. Someone who believes in people, someone who sees the light, even in the most twisted souls. But eventually, even the light gets tired of being ignored. Even the sun stops rising for those who sleep through every sunrise. And when that moment came, when you realized you were being taken, drained, played, you didn't cry. You didn't beg. You just became quiet. And in that quiet, you built power. You became something else, not a monster, not a victim, just a ghost with unfinished business. And that business, it ain't revenge, it's elevation. It's leveling up in silence while they drown in the chaos they created. They'll never tell the full story. They'll never admit how they lied to you with a smile, how they made you question your own worth while pretending they were the ones being wronged. They'll never talk about the moments you gave them a piece of your soul and they responded with silence. But that's fine. That's the beauty of silence. You don't need their version. You have your own truth. And your truth doesn't need to be heard to exist. Doesn't need approval. Doesn't need an audience. It just is. And your truth, it's made of fire now. It walks alone. It doesn't flinch. It doesn't wait. It simply moves forward. You're no longer asking, why did they treat me like this? You already know. You were light in the hands of someone who preferred darkness. You were water to someone who wanted to drown. You were stability to someone addicted to chaos. So they rejected you. Not because of you, but because of what you exposed in them. And now they're left trying to replace you with people who can't even replicate a fraction of what you were. And you're not watching. You're not hoping. You're not stalking from the shadows. You're gone, unreachable, unmatched. And that's what terrifies them most. The thing is, you didn't even want to be the cold one. That wasn't the goal. You wanted connection. You wanted depth. You wanted something real. But real doesn't survive in fake environments. And once you realized you were the only one trying to build a future, while they were living in the moment, you had no choice but to become what they feared. Silent, emotionless, focused. And when you did that, when you became untouchable, they lost all their power. They don't have access to you anymore, not to your time, your mind, your heart. And no matter how many apologies they rehearse in their heads, it won't matter, because you're not angry. You're not bitter. You're not sitting in the past. You're just unavailable. You took all the love you gave them and turned it inward. You took all the energy you wasted on them and built your next chapter. And they're stuck rereading the last one, hoping somehow it ends differently. But it doesn't. You already wrote the final line. You didn't lose control. You handed it over and let the fire consume what never deserved to survive.